rise of Islamism was in fact a dialogical outcome of Muslims abandoning the diversity of their own intellectual heritage and turning Islam into a singular site of resistance to European colonialism. And as a result, the West that they generated and the Islam is a binary that they just corroborate in each other. Of course, I've been out in the street kicking and screaming in support of grassroots social movements that aims at nothing short of dismantling this ruling regime, but not when US and Israel enter the scene. That's a whole different ballgame.
But it gets very difficult politically and practically of how to put those ideas into motion when you have a menace like Zionism wreaking havoc in the area. It feels very hard not to fall into the trap of my enemy is my friend and rooting on, the Ayatollah. And obviously you're warning against this.
The enemy of my enemy is not my friend.
Yeah.
And as I said, we are all capable of seeing Zionism for what Zionism is. So one has to be careful, Jay, that critical position vis-a-vis an act in Israel is not a justification of the other. We are free. We can make compound sentences with multiple subordinate clauses in order to come closer to the precision of what is happening in history.
Dilemma Podcast, Jay Shapiro here. First, a thank you to the members who joined for my first ever live stream monthly meetup. As you saw, I'm going to try next time to do it in Zoom, so maybe we can meet each other in a fun way and you guys can connect with each other as well. But it was awesome. I really appreciate it. So consider becoming a member if you want to join and have a monthly last Sunday of every month at noon Eastern time live stream that I'm going to do on Zoom and then also simulcast on YouTube. But super fun. I'll answer questions and also help us meet each other a little bit more. So thank you for that. And now this conversation that I'm having today was with Hamid Dabashi, and it's such a privilege. He's such a prolific author and scholar and commentator. This is his, I'll just put it on the screen. This is his book list that he's written. I don't even know how many. Just to say prolific is an understatement. He's been in the public eye and thinking out loud and writing incredible books with a focus on Iran in particular, but Islam and also cinema for so long, and has such an amazing catalog that it was just such an amazing privilege to speak with him. And he's such a fantastic thinker and scholar. He also, I think you'll be able to track some of the thoughts, kind of falls in line with my previous guest, Nandita Sharma. And let's just be honest here, ultimately a sort of anarchistic philosophy, which is just skeptical of any notion of the construct of state, and in particular nation state. And I think the fusion of those two concepts, nation and state, one being nation, I'm saying here, is sort of a kind of natural phenomena of human communal behavior based around, shared or historical behavior or habits or beliefs, even music and art, etc. Nation is kind of an innocuous, natural thing, but maybe with its own kind of dangers. But state as the unnatural kind of legal consensus truth that we sort of take on with its own kind of circular, self-evident logic and justification of its own, as he'll point to, sort of monopoly of violence. And so those two ideas, state and nation, fusing, I think, into a sort of disastrous situation. So you could track that in the conversation. And also, I just want to put this as a pre-thought. The conversation with Hamid was awesome, and it got me thinking about something that I want to just kind of put out here. It's not a sort of fully formed thought, but see how it hits you, because the sort of left-right political binary is just massively unsatisfying. I'm sure it's become unsatisfying to you. It doesn't really explain anything. It doesn't really mean anything anymore, if it ever did, honestly. And so Hamid, at one point in our conversation about Iran history and the kind of historical and political context that he offers of the 1979 revolution, he presents kind of three particular forces as he recognized them, and he calls them third world socialism, anti-colonial nationalism, and militant Islam. And you'll see how he walks through that in the way that he sees that playing out in the particular situation of Iran, or I think, frankly, in very similar ways and similar dynamics in other neighboring nations at the time. I've recommended the film The Square on this channel before, but I'll do it again now to kind of put on your watch list about Egypt during the Arab Spring, where you'll see these kinds of three forces, I think, play out in real time. But I just kept thinking as he was explaining this, and I've been thinking about it more about this point, and wondering if there's something a little bit more universal to say about these forces that kind of presents a better model than this left-right binary, which is just obviously failing kind of everywhere. So I'm kind of thinking about it more like a triangle with these three forces. And I'm kind of like deep philosophical existential orientations of this triangle represented there, where you kind of have a state model in one corner where this nation state becomes kind of the sacred unit or organization of human political interaction. This is very much the liberal, rules-based world order framework of nation states. And then in another node of sort of this triangle, you have ultimately kind of a divine or godly grounded orientation in which to organize society and questions of politics and morality. And I think politics and morality really are basically the same thing. And so that's where that's ultimately cashed out in that sense. And then there's another node that's kind of an agnostic or I think humanistic orientation, which emphasizes cooperation over competition, and perhaps embraces more of a, I would argue, this just unfortunate fact of the universe we're in, of a sort of ethical ambiguity where moral certainty and moral realism gives way to something much more flimsy and contestable. So I think, these three nodes, given whatever context of time and history and specific mythologies that are around you, can manifest into various political movements. Perhaps certain forms of anarchy or communism or socialism can spring from sort of this one. But certainly it can also drift into nationalistic, state worship kind of stuff in this sort of liberal world order. And then all kinds of various theocratic movements, from Christian nationalism to Islamism, as he points out in this case, or Hindu nationalism, etc. They form from this one. And I think there's something that I kind of like about thinking in this triangle form, because it reminds you that if you find yourself, and I'm really thinking of these not as sort of strict political systems, but actually an internal psychological and maybe existential philosophical tug of war that we all sort of the human condition is to have this kind of triangle tug at you. If you find yourself too enraptured or captured by one particular node, and then you move from it or you drift from it, you're not automatically going towards kind of the right direction in some sort of political trajectory. You have two other nodes pulling at you in their own kind of awful ways. Anyway, it's not really a fully formed idea or thesis, obviously, in my head, but something to think about, which Hamid in this conversation really has me considering. And I'm also, presenting this again, this triangle of forces as a kind of internal psychological and existential model to contend with, not something imposed from the outside, but a kind of grouping of conflicting forces, fears, weaknesses, our courageous aspects of ourselves, the fearful aspects of ourselves, which end up giving birth to these political movements and nation states or theologies around us. Okay, so I'll jump into the conversation now with just the absolutely incredible Hamid Dabashi, and then just to track something that he responds to. Specifically, we spoke a little bit before I started recording, and I relayed my background and kind of intellectual path to these questions and these conversations with the likes of the New Atheists and Sam Harris, of course. So he ends up directly responding to some of that you'll hear, just so you understand what he's doing there. And then you also hear in the last 10 minutes or so of the interview that I couldn't help myself but ask him about Iranian film and the tradition of Iranian film. He's written a few books on this subject. I'm a filmmaker, and I absolutely love films that come out of Iran, so many films that have come out of Iran. So if you're looking to add some things to your watch list, stick around for the end. I'll be back at the end, as usual, with a very quick afterthought and to prep you for my next conversation on dilemma as well. But for now, enjoy Hamid Dabashi. But the first question I always ask everyone, sort of a bit of a personal biography. You've had such a long career, but tell me about where you were born, where you grew up, and what eventually led you to these kinds of questions and this amazing output of books that you've done in your life.
Well, thank you for having me, Jay, first and foremost. Yes, the world is becoming very fragmented.
Hmm.
So we're part of that, but I'm happy to talk to you. Uh, I was born and raised in southern part of Iran, Ahvaz, June 15th, 1951. And I just actually a couple of years ago, I wrote a book which is my childhood memories, 1950s and 1960s. Is called An Iranian Childhood, sort of plays between history and memory. And then more recently, I wrote another autobiographical account of my years as an undergrad in Tehran, where I went to college. It's called Subversive 70s in Tehran, Romancing Revolution, when I was an undergraduate student. So I had a very ordinary and rather uh, domestic life, uh, working class parents, high school, etc., until I went to college in Tehran. I was in Tehran for college in 1970s. Michael Hart wrote an amazing book about subversive 70s, just about the time that I was beginning to think about my own 70s in Tehran. So he and I have been in touch. I'm a great fan of his thinking and scholarship. So in 1976, I was sort of finishing my undergraduate years in Tehran, and one thing led to another, and I moved to US. I went to University of Pennsylvania, did my PhD in sociology and cultural studies. Then I went to Harvard, did my postdoc at Harvard. Then eventually I ended up at Columbia, and I've been at Columbia for since late 1980s. Uh, I don't know how much, Jay, does that tell you about the
Yeah.
trajectory of my intellectual development? I really don't know. I mean, until we get into the specifics. So, on the surface, it appears that my scholarship is kind of my serious work, and the work I do on more contemporary issues is different. But in my own mind, despite the fact that I'm a Gemini, they're related. They're part of the same person,
Hmm.
but thinking in two different registers.
Yeah.
I cannot not do my serious scholarship as I always do, and I cannot not do my serious engagement with contemporary more. For me, there are more moral issues than political issues.
Yeah.
What is happening in Gaza is a moral matter. Uh, I've been equally uh, concerned and preoccupied with Armenian genocide, with, of course, with Holocaust. Uh, so yeah, they're part
Yeah.
of the same extension. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's get into it then, to those things, because there's an interesting parallel. You were born June of 51, which is the same exact month as my mother, and there's this like interesting parallel. So I'm this next generation, and she was born in Pennsylvania, is where I grew up, and there's almost this parallel. But then let me go to, and I will have just told you this, but I'll include it in the open. I gave you a little bit about my background and when I jumped into these questions of just, I was a film student when 9/11 hit, and that started my thinking in many ways on these bigger philosophical and political questions. I continued and got my film degree, but never stopped my philosophical education on the moral question. And I have to admit, I was quite captivated and taken in by the argument that Islam was the reason why 9/11 happened, and Islam is this big beast that must be contended with. And I want you to respond to that, but like maybe your seminal work, or maybe your most famous work, The Theology of Discontent. I want you to talk a little bit about that thesis, because I've lately, as I've been sort of dismantling that sort of simple racist idea that kind of was in my head, I think, and becoming much more thinking in terms of anti-colonialism and imperialism and getting wise to the economics of the world, and that it's not such a simple story about beliefs in an afterlife and all this kind of stuff. I've begun to think in my own mind about Islam, and you put it perfectly, I think, in the book. You can tell me the thesis, but Islam very much as a vehicle, or it's become a vehicle of anti-colonial, anti-imperial energies. I'm interested in, I know that's kind of your thesis, but I'm also interested in how historically true that is. Is that kind of how you see Islam from the beginning? Like, was Muhammad a political figure in that same sense, or is this a newer iteration of this idea?
Uh, the best way to start, Jay, is that if you look at the text of the Quran, uh, it consists of two major parts, the Meccan chapters and Medinan chapters. And they have a dialectical relationship already in the text of the Quran. The Prophet began his career in Mecca. So the Meccan chapters are very short and bombastic and declarative and, this and that. And then the Medinan chapters are more expanded and more constitution building and so forth. I usually, when I teach it, I compare the first part of the Quran to Declaration of Independence from a previous social context, and the second more a constitution. So already you have one is a destructing a system, one is constructing a system. So you already the system, the text itself is paradoxical within itself, and that has been the history of Islam throughout. Much later when I was reading Walter Benjamin says there is no monument to civilization which at the same time is not a monument to barbarism. There is a glorious aspect of Islamic civilization, art, industry, history, culture, civilization, etc. But at the same time, by the same token, the same civilization that generates all of these glorious scientific and literary and philosophical achievements generates an underclass within itself because of any empire. All empires generate underclass that begins to revolt against that order, and they use the same religion, the same metaphysical order in order to justify the rebellion. So there has always been an internal fight within Islam itself throughout history. And the book that I did on Shiism is not just on Shiism, but it's on the revolutionary and rebellious aspect of Islam as a religion. And there too, I come out with a paradox that Shiism is only legitimate so far as it speaks truth to power, so far as it is a religion of protest. And as soon as it succeeds to establish a dynasty, a political order, it contradicts itself. And as a result becomes illegitimate. But what has happened over the last 200, 250 years, it is an added element of European colonialism. That is, you have the global imperial domination of European origin, the British in India, the French in North Africa, the Germans elsewhere, the Belgians in Congo. All of this begin to generate resistance to European imperial project. That resistance is not exclusively Islamic, is actually of three different gestation. One is a third world socialism, one is anti-colonial nationalism, and one is militant Islamism. And these three are always in dialogical conversation, contestation with each other. So Islam or militant Islam, or what I call Islamism, is not the only mode of resistance. It was legitimate for a while, but after a while, especially I would say after the establishment of the Islamic Republic in Iran and the rise of the Taliban and the rise of Al-Qaeda, 9/11, you mentioned 9/11. 9/11 was the product of not a political ideology with an economics, with the politics, etc., was in fact violence for a spectacular reason. people like Sam Harris, you mentioned, they are constitutionally illiterate people. They don't read anything. They don't know anything. I used to be reading him to see what is it that he has to say. He has nothing. He knows nothing about nothing, and he
Yeah.
talks about Islam is this and that. Uh, Political militant Islamism was always part of assemblage, as they call it, a constellation of political positions. Particularly important was anti-colonial nationalism of Nasser in Egypt, Mossadegh in Iran, Nehru in India. If you don't know those movements, you don't understand what Islamism is. You think Islamism is everything.
Yeah.
Is not everything, is one aspect of, even in the context of Palestine today, Hamas is just one tiny element of the Palestinian resistance. Palestinian national liberation is, in fact, overwhelmingly peaceful. Overwhelmingly is civil disobedience. But yes, they have also militant aspects to their things. Reducing the entirety of the Palestinian situation to Hamas and Hamas as terrorists, of course, distorts the reality of how this works. But going back to your original question, my concern in theology of discontent was actually how the rise of Islamism was, in fact, the dialogical outcome of Muslims abandoning the diversity of their own intellectual heritage and turning Islam into a singular site of resistance to European colonialism. And as a result, the West that they generated and the Islam is a binary that they just corroborate in each other. The binary that I sought to dismantle in my most recent book in University of California Press, Islam after the West, because these two illusions corroborate each other. And people who attack militant Islamism should be attacked, but in the context of how it emerged, not this obsessive so-called atheism, which is not really atheism, is Islamophobia garbed as atheism. Atheism is a perfectly legitimate position to have. Is to contextualize its historical context, when and how it emerged. Islamism, as a result, as in fact I say, both Islamism and Zionism are the twin products of European colonialism at the same time. They're identical with each other.
Yeah, no, say more about that, because because I could hear the past crowds with Sam Harris chirping in my head saying that this militant Islamist thing generates from the text itself, and it just keeps re-emerging itself like a monster no matter what this guy Hamid is saying. It's in the text and they're just following the text and it's always there to be discovered. I mean, how do you respond to that? You think historically it's inaccurate?
Yeah, I mean, I always say, I'm not in a position to go to Osama bin Laden and say, you are not a good Muslim.
Yeah.
Of course he's a good Muslim. The same way that I'm not in a position to go to this ultra-Zionist ministers in cabinet of Netanyahu and say, you're not really a good Jew. Who am I to nobody can go and say you're not Jewish enough or a good Jewish. Or for me to go, of course they're Muslim. Of course they have every right. And they go to the Quran and they find passages in the Quran that justifies their action. But it is the same Quran that generated Ibn Arabi and generated Rumi. Rumi is the most popular poet in United States. How did that happen? Now, they tried to de-Islamize Rumi, that Rumi is a mystic or whatever, or a New Age character. No, he is not. He was a Muslim mystic. And in fact, there is an expression in Persian that his Masnavi is Quran in Persian. So you cannot say, no, only Osama bin Laden and others are Muslim, and this fantastic array of philosophers and mystics and poets and scientists, that they are not Muslims? Why? By what authority? See, it's a contorted view. I mean, Islam is capable of violence, as everything else is capable of violence. Was Christianity not capable of violence during the Crusades? Was Judaism not capable of Zionism and the genocide that it is now being committed in the name of horrified Jews around the globe who don't have anything to do with this genocide? Of course. So militant Muslims, Osama bin Laden, etc., they have had Mullah Omar. They have had every right as Muslims to go to the text of the Quran and find one thing or another that they think justifies their barbaric behavior. So we cannot completely exonerate Islam of everything, nor can we exonerate Judaism or Islam or Buddhism. Is Buddhism exonerated? Look at Myanmar.
Yeah.
I mean, we always thought Buddhism is the most humane, the gentlest form of religion, and by and large, it is. But at the same time, it created this horrid militant Buddhist that emerged in Myanmar. So the issue ultimately, Jay, is not, we should not fixate on one religion or another.
Yeah.
Is the same way to fixate on Judaism? No, Judaism from the very beginning was Zionism. It's just gibberish. It's total gibberish.
Yeah.
Greatest philosophers have come out from Judaism. Mystics have come. One of the greatest civilizations has emerged out of Judaism. I'm particularly interested in Judeo-Persian in work that I do, history of philosophy, history of mysticism, etc. And it is obscene to think that this particular event that happened in Zionism over the last 100 years, 150 years, is the quintessence of Judaism. The same is with Islam. There is nothing quintessential about anything, but there are issues that are happening around the world. For example, the rise of Zionism has a lot to do with a history of sustained anti-Semitism, of pogroms, of Holocaust. So I totally understand the anxiety of a contemporary Jewish person whose parents or grandparents perished in the course of the Holocaust, to be afraid of the rise of anti-Semitism. But this doesn't justify the weaponization of anti-Semitism, that as soon as you say anything about Israel, that suddenly becomes anti-Semitic. In short, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, you name it, Hinduism, they are all capable of the most glorious achievements of human civilization, but they're also capable of, this is the paradox, this is Walter Benjamin's point, of atrocities in the name of these religions.
Yeah, well said. This one might sound like a dumb one, but I want to obviously speak a lot about Iran with you. Why is Israel so obsessed with Iran, or maybe Netanyahu in particular? What's the historical explanation? I watched his UN speech yet again. How do you answer this now, and how frustrating is it for you, I'm sure?
Jay, the last thing in the world I want to be known for, that I have an inroad into the mind of a sick, diabolic genocide perpetrator like Netanyahu. What the hell do I know? All we can do as intelligent human beings is to speculate. Right now, Netanyahu's government is engaged in one of the most atrocious genocides in human history. And what he does, invading Lebanon, invading Syria, invading Iran, invading, etc., is just keep pushing the boundaries of what he calls Greater Israel in order to divert attention from the fact that they have a singular mission to gobble up the entirety of Palestine and get it over with. And Palestinians are not disappearing. They're not going anywhere. I mean, you cannot do what worse than what they are doing in Gaza, and Palestinians are not going anywhere. So his obsession with Iran is the obsession of a warlord in charge of a settler colony, of a garrison state that wants to shape the entirety of the region in its own image, the image of a garrison state. And in many ways, it has succeeded. That is, the ruling regime in Islamic Republic acts like a garrison state. In fact, the idea of the garrison state has been originally formulated in the US, but eventually applied elsewhere.
This was by Harold Laswell, right?
Harold Laswell, precisely, is very much applicable to Iran as well. Namely, the ruling regime in Iran has been the subject of repeated rebellion by Iranians, but not rebellion by Iranians that Netanyahu thinks they will pour into the streets and topple the regime for Islamic Republic. These people are demented. I mean, they need just one course in the history of anti-colonial nationalism in Iran to understand how Iranians behave. They detest a significant population of Iranian citizens detest the ruling regime, but they detest any foreigner, especially a country perpetrating a genocide, to come and be their savior,
Yeah.
What a hell. And then this distorted reading of the magnificent book of Esther. I wrote when he came and said, oh, the book of Esther, uh, the book of Esther is a Persian queen. The entire history of the text of uh, book of Esther is not Jews against Iranians. Jews are Iranians. Jews were Iranians. Esther, whose grave is in my homeland, is in Iran, was a Jewish a queen. So it is not Jews versus Iranian, it's just gibberish. But they are rereading and pathologically sort of abusing history of Judaism, biblical interpretations, Iranian history, in order to justify something that is not justifiable.
Yeah.
Having said that, the other gibberish that comes from people like Ahmadinejad denying Holocaust or nonsense like that is equally horrible. Who the hell is Ahmadinejad to question the validity of one of the most atrocious aspects of atrocities in human history? So one has to be careful, Jay, that critical position vis-a-vis an act in Israel is not a justification of the other. We are free. We can make compound sentences with multiple subordinate clauses in order to come closer to the precision of what is happening in history.
Yeah, that was great. Let me try to give you a little bit of my hypothesis. Then, like you said, we could just hypothesize, and you could tell me how accurate you think it is. I mean, the only part of that. So I grew up in sort of a Zionist environment, and the only part of the sort of the greater Israel project that you put on the table as a territorial, ambitious mission, which is certainly a thread. It's a trend within Zionism. It's true, but I think maybe a more powerful explanatory variable is Israel thought of as an outpost of the American imperial project or the Western imperial project, which dates back to Mossadegh and the things that you've talked about. I've talked about it plenty on my show, so people probably don't need the history lesson. But when you look around Israel's behavior with Nasser, who you mentioned, and Syria and Lebanon and Saudi Arabia was before, Iran strikes me as always the one that got away. And that's why the obsession has always been there's the one that got away from the British and certainly the Americans, where they were thrilled. You know, the Shah was the plan, Mossadegh was the threat, the nationalism of the oil and everything, and the Shah was their lovely pet project, which reeks identical to what happens in Dubai and everywhere else in Qatar and the Middle East. And then that's the one that got away until 1979. So I don't know if you want to talk about your experience of 1979 and the revolution and how that version of Islamism came to be. But for me, that's always the one that is the explanatory sort of reason for Israel reminding the West of, hey, we'll get that one back for you. That's the one that got away.
No,
we haven't forgotten, right?
You're absolutely right. Two things, Jay, in what you say. Number one, you know that in US there is this question: who is the dog and who is wagging the tail?
Right.
Is it Israel through AIPAC, etc., or is it United States? And but as you rightly said, Israel is a colonial outpost of American empire, period.
Yeah.
And is not the only one. Qatar is another one. United Arab Emirates is another one. Through NATO, Turkey is a thing. Diego Garcia. I always compare Israel with Diego Garcia. There is the way that the Pentagon thinks is not, oh, we're our close ally. Nothing. Israel is a military base totally at the service of United States, and they use it. So my progressive colleagues, are absolutely correct to accuse people who are just fixated on AIPAC. Yes, AIPAC is a fifth column, works for Israel, but the AIPAC would not be able to do what AIPAC is doing. First of all, is it like any other promoting the interests of a particular group, coal industry or fossil fuel industry. Second, it is a post, it is a place, it is a military apparatus at the service of American interests in the region. And that's why when something like Qatar happens, you see you have a sort of a competition between two military bases. Now, going back to the second part of your question, namely the 1979 revolution, at the start of the revolution, when a revolution actually happened, and here we need specific dates and time, etc., that the start of the revolution was actually 10 nights of poetry reading at the German Goethe Institute, and had nothing to do with this so-called letter, insulting letter that one journal, a newspaper published against Ayatollah Khomeini. So we have to trace it back to 1977, not 1979. I mean, these are the details of historiography of the Iranian Revolution. What's the point? The point is that at the time of Iranian Revolution, there were three forces at work. There was anti-colonial nationalism of Mossadegh from 1953, after the coup that it still was carrying on. It had its constituency, it had its forces, it had its text, etc. So we have one anti-colonial nationalism tracing back. One was a militant Islamism, yes, that began in 1963, a decade later, led by Ayatollah Khomeini. It was defeated and he was pushed into exile in Najaf. And this third one that people don't know unless they are scholars of the field was a guerrilla uprising of 1971 by Marxist revolutionaries inspired by Che Guevara and Fidel Castro and so forth. So you have three dates, Jay: 1953, anti-colonial nationalism; 1963, militant Islamism; 1971, Third World Socialism or militant Marxism. These are the three forces at work when the Iranian Revolution of 1977-79 is happening. These three forces are in the streets. They're fighting.
Yeah.
What happened?
Was there a name for the Marxist group in Iran? Because I
Yes,
don't know.
Sharikai Fadai Khalq, the
Okay.
Fadai Khalq guerrilla organization. As an undergraduate student, I was active with them. I was supporting
Gotcha.
them, I was promoting them. Now, the thing is that two events happen early in the revolution that enables Khomeini to destroy all its ideological rivals. The first is, of course, the American hostage crisis of November 1979 to January 4th, 1981, 444 days. You're too young to remember, but your parents will remember. Those were extremely important. Under the guise of fighting imperialism and fighting American this and that, what Khomeini was actually doing was destroying the leftist foundation of the revolution, destroying the anti-colonial nationalists, destroying the Third World Socialist. Before the hostage crisis was even finished in January 1981, in September 1980, the Iran-Iraq War had started. Iran-Iraq War went for another 8 years, from 1980 to 1988. Khomeini could have ended the Iran-Iraq War within 6 months. Saddam Hussein was not successful. He could have ended it. I mean, of course, Americans and Europeans were arming Saddam Hussein. And through the Iran-Contra affair, this gets a little bit more detailed, they were also arming Iran in order for the two of them to fight. But again, under the smoke screen of 8 years of Iran-Iraq War, Khomeini conducted university purges that happened, two cultural revolutions happened, mass execution of the political left in prisons, so pacified the alternative resistances that existed and created this monstrosity of Islamic Republic that has been ruling for now for decades. So we have to understand the dynamics of multiple forces that were at work from the 70s to 80s to 90s, etc., before we come to the conclusion. And as you see, for its entirety of history, Islamic Republic has been challenged by generations of young people who are wired, they're connected to the rest of the world, and under the severe, backbreaking, ungodly sanctions that US and Europe have imposed on Iran, Iran's middle class, Jay, has completely disappeared. There is no middle class. There is only the ruling regime and the impoverished masses. So, but under these circumstances, what the idiocy of Israeli leaders don't understand is, if you want to unite the entirety of the 90 million Iranians behind the ruling regime, drop a bomb on Iran. Give you example. I cannot set foot in my own homeland without directly going to jail.
Yeah.
But I have publicly opposed attacking military attack against my own people that only targets civilians, and the civilian and in fact exacerbates the totalitarian tendencies of the ruling regime.
So then would you support the regime falling? And then like that's what you hope to see happen, is the Islamic regime fall, but not at the behest of Zionism. And yeah,
Absolutely.
And I guess just also for the history lesson there too, I'm a little unclear as to why the Ayatollah and the Islamist regime or rising kind of energy or whatever would want to crush the leftists around them just because they wanted absolute
They
power.
were totalitarian. They were
Okay.
totalitarian.
Yeah.
They couldn't stand the possibility or the prospect of a multifaceted society, which Iran has been, with the
Yeah.
left and the seculars and the liberals and the anti-colonial nationalists, etc. They wanted is a totalitarian regime.
And you think what just was driving the popularity of that was just the frustration, the pent up anger, the sanctions, the anti-colonial energy.
But again, if you look at the history of Iran of the last 40 years, before this attack by Israel and the United States, there is no 5 years in Iranian history when you don't have a massive revolt, especially by the younger generation. The last of which was 3 years ago. I just wrote a book on Nan Zendegi Azadi uprising, led by women demanding and exacting their civil liberties. So, of course, I've been out in the street kicking and screaming in support of grassroots social movements that aims at nothing short of dismantling this ruling regime, but not when U.S. and Israel enter the scene. That's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, I was reading some of this recent book, which is so good. I think I have some quotes from it here, but I don't even need to really give them back to you. But your anger is palpable at the hypocrisy of the West and the rhetoric about supporting democracy and supporting women's rights and all this kind of stuff there. I don't know if you just, because I saw the images of the women with what was the chant again? It was like women, freedom, life, something like that.
Zendegi Azadi. Zan Zendegi Azadi. It resonates with Z. Zan, woman, Zendegi, life, Azadi, freedom.
Yeah.
The origin of it is actually Kurdish, comes from the Kurdish rising, and then comes to Persian.
But yeah, I mean, if you just want to respond to it, because of course I was part of the energy of like rooting them on, but
I was all over the place. I still root for it, but now I have suspended that because of I cannot side with and my opposition and criticism and denunciation of the Israeli-U.S. Bombing of Iran does not translate into supporting Islamic Republic. As I said, we are intelligent people. We are capable of multiple clauses in our sentences. It has nothing to do with a thing. What am I? I mean, it goes back to one of the initial questions. Always from my undergraduate years, we have two fundamental nemeses. One is global imperialism, one is domestic tyranny. The fighting against both of them is sort of in the DNA of our political thinking. Simple as that. You don't have to side with Islamic Republic in order to oppose Israel. You don't have to side with Israel and United States in order to show your denunciation of a reactionary, ghastly Islamist regime.
Yeah. Well, I think you've done well to try to thread that needle. Also, it doesn't seem that hard rhetorically, but then on the streets, it gets a little challenging. Actually, I'll throw this one by because I just interviewed Nandita Sharma, who's you wrote a book about I think inevitable demise of the nation state. I forget the name of it. It had the really cool cover. The Emperor. Was it The Emperor Has No Clothes? I forget. Maybe
that's my book.
That's your book. Yes, you wrote that book. I'm saying you wrote a book, but that's no. I'm saying you and her, I think, share and I agree. A sort of the nation state as a concept. I'll put my anarchist cards on the table. Is a flawed idea and an unfree idea. But it gets very difficult politically and practically of how to put those ideas into motion when you have a menace like Zionism wreaking havoc in the area, it feels very hard not to fall into the trap of my enemy is my friend and rooting on, you know, the Ayatollah. And obviously you're warning against this.
The enemy of my enemy is not my friend.
Yeah.
And as I said, we are all capable of seeing Zionism for what Zionism is. First and foremost, as somebody who has lived in the US for decades,
Yeah.
exonerating the noble history of Jewish participation in civil rights movement, anti-colonial movement, socialist movements, forefront of it from this ghastly Zionist thing. It has nothing to do with anything. And second, seeing the similarity between Islamism and Zionism as two byproducts of European colonialism, and seeing the possibility of a collective emancipation. I remember when I was writing my book on the Arab Spring, at the very end, at the time, I said, and the implications of these collective uprisings will not be and should not be underestimated in Israel. And within months after I wrote this, there was actually massive demonstrations in Israel. Right now, the fact is, I mean, because of my own friends and colleagues and students, former students who are teaching in Israel, not for a minute do I believe that entirety of Israel is for this. They keep doing polls that 80% of Israelis support this government. I don't believe that for a minute. It's impossible. Yes, I'm sure there are supporters, as 70 million voted for Donald Trump in this country. And the division between yellow and blue states and red states means nothing. Right here on Columbia campus, Upper West Side, I'm sure there are plenty of people who voted for Donald Trump. So one has to, I'm absolutely convinced that one has to bring 7, 8, 9 million Israelis who live in Israel, who are trapped within this particular abuse of their religion, into the fold of humanity in the larger context of the region, into the fold of what is happening in Egypt, in Palestine, in Turkey, in Iran, etc. So my way of looking at things is a whole different. There is no Israel versus everybody else. It's just gibberish, doesn't add up, doesn't make sense. The same way that right now in my city, Zohran Mamdani is most probably would be the next first Muslim mayor, and he has a fantastic Jewish component and denominator among his supporters. So it is imperative for us to have a different conception. Is not, and yes, there is anti-Semitism, and who is exonerating? Elon Musk gives a Nazi salute in a gathering, and who exonerates him? Is the Anti-Defamation League exonerate him because they think he's pro-Israel, not that evident anti-Semitism that they see. Donald Trump is the most anti-Semitic horror that ever existed, but because he's pro-Israel, they look the other way. So my point is, we need a different configuration of how we imagine the future of the region and the future of our humanity in a sense that is embracing, that is enabling others all to come to join. Particularly the post-Holocaust generation has every right. I know of the argument of the Holocaust industry and all of that. Yes, I understand. But still the fact is that the next generation of post-Holocaust survivors whose parents, grandparents have perished in Holocaust have every reason to have anxiety of survival in this world. But I don't know of any other way than the fact that Iranian Jews are Iranian, American Jews are American, Egyptian Jews are Egyptian. Sort of telling them, although you have to go to Israel in order to be safe, is just insanely anti-Semitic proposition to say. Jews, like Muslims, like everybody else, have to be safe wherever they are, including in Palestine. Jews have always lived in Palestine, but with their neighbors. with their Muslim neighbors and Christian neighbors and atheists, God bless them, neighbors. So
Yeah.
the answer is very simple.
So I want you to respond to the current moment before I take probably another detour in your career into the cinema stuff. But the current moment post October 7th seems, we've never been here. This is new territory in world events and world opinion. So I want you just to sort of respond. You've been in America for several decades, and I'm sure you've never seen it quite like this, of the kind of boiling point we're at. And then I also want, because you're such a learned philosopher, and I love it. It was sort of my education too. I'm going to be having a lot of guests on to contend with, I think, the perpetual moral dilemma of the question of violence and liberation and their very fraught relationship. And I'm curious your sort of moral, ethical, political analysis of, as taboo as it is, October 7th, this awful thing, the by any means necessary argument. I had Mubarak Awad on my show, who was known as the Palestinian Gandhi and dedicated to resistance through nonviolence for his whole life before he was deported by Israel. But he was very clear to be like, it's resistance through nonviolence, right? And he said, he met with Hamas, and many of them were completely open to it because they just want their liberation however they can get it. You're saying it works putting, rose petals on doorsteps and saying this is at my grandparents' house or whatever. If that works, I'll do that. If blowing up a subway works, I'll do that. I'm just desperate for anything. So respond to the current moment. And then obviously the current moment is tied to a violent, spectacular act of October 7th.
Absolutely. First of all, you begin with October 7th and categorically, without any hesitation, without any however, this and that, you denounce the horrid and criminal act of October 7th, the murder and mayhem of people who were just entirely caught unaware. There is no justification. You cannot care for the cause of Palestinian liberation without caring simultaneously for the precious life of one human being who happens to be an Israeli. So there is no sort of, yes, it is justified, etc. It is not justified. It is a violent act, has to be denounced categorically and without hesitation. But October 7 had October 6 and had October 8. So let's start with events leading to October 7 and continue with these events after October 7. After October 7, we have global consensus that we are facing a genocide of an entire nation, an entire people. It has nothing to do with Hamas. Hamas is one minor aspect of Palestinian resistance. The overwhelming majority of it is actually nonviolent. And in the form of civil disobedience, which is the BDS movement. What is the BDS movement? It's just a Gandhian project of non-cooperation. What else do you want from Palestinians? This is not to justify Hamas, but just to see Hamas in the context of a larger national liberation movement, the same way that we look at Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Of course, I mean, in the context of millions of Jews being slaughtered by the Nazis, of course you have militant resistance and all the power to them. Again, this is not an equivalency that Warsaw Ghetto movement is equal Hamas. It is not. Mm-hmm. These are two different contexts. But one, at the same time, with the same breath that you denounce any act of violence, I'm a militant pacifist. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, to me it does, yeah. Yeah.
Not a single human life. I mean, Israeli, Jewish, man, woman, child, whatever, caught unaware with their guards down, being slaughtered. What sort of a justification? What sort of a future can you imagine for Palestinian national liberation if it is predicated on that kind of act of violence? You have to bring Israelis and Jewish and Israelis into the domain of a Palestinian national liberation, for them to be able to envision, to see themselves as neighbors and living in the same country. I've been to Palestine, Jay. I've traveled from one end of Palestine and in Israel. There are 7 million plus Israelis. There are 7 million plus Palestinians. There's plenty of room for all of them. In New York, we have more population than both of them put together. It is this exclusivist thing that either yours or mine. I mean, what the hell is this? Just relax, put your guards down, and the rest is easy. October 7, no doubt, but more for Palestinian and Israelis on the ground rather than for us in the US, which they're abusing it. Trump is abusing October 7 for its own reasons and purposes. So we need to laser beam on events in Palestine. Right now, the most urgent thing is ceasefire. Stop killing people. That's the first thing. Put the guns down. Put the bombs down. And then come to recognition, Palestinians are not going anywhere. Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians in West Bank, Palestinians inside Israel, they're not going anywhere. There is only one solution, which is a one-state solution. Or as an anarchist friend of mine said, I thought you were an anarchist, you were a non-state solution. So non-state. None of them, I'm a great fan of a thing. But there is no other way. There is no, right now, they're coming with this two-state solution. What two-state solution? Where do you want to put it? On paper? In the UN?
Yeah.
And then at the same time, sort of disregarding the fact that the genocide is happening, the fact that there is a dispossession happening in the West Bank. So the solution for reasonable, sane people is very simple. If you're reasonable and if you're sane, just the two of them get together. And I'm not the first one. Said said it, many other. Elon Pape has been saying it. There are historians, there are people far more qualified to judge who have said it. So we need to, right now, for example, the things that are happening in Europe, especially in Germany, this rise of this new fascism that is happening in Europe or in England. Or in Germany, or in the US, one has to separate them. They're abusing the Israeli-Palestinian issue for their own domestic reasons, but for the rise of this new fascist right. If you compound them, then really there is no solution. Everything keeps coming. But we need to pull back, separate the American scene from the Palestinian scene, and begin to address domestic.
Yeah, I guess to needle you on just on that philosophical point though of violence and liberation though, I'm still interested in your denounce. I heard, but so I had a challenging conversation almost a year ago now with Richard English, who wrote a book called "Does Terrorism Work?" which is a very provocative title, and I'm almost asking you to respond to the thesis of the title. In some abstract way. I'm not trying to corner you on it. It's something I'm struggling with, right?
Listen, I always begin with Max Weber's definition of state, not with Fanon. Everybody begins with the first chapter of Wretched of the Earth. Max Weber, 1919, defined a state as a monopoly of violence. Liberal German sociologist, has nothing to do with anything, defined a state as monopoly of violence. A state is a monopoly of violence. Those who are fighting for the state, want to replace the state, are challenging the state, obviously they also appeal to violence. So there is a relationship between violence and a state, not violence and nation. This is, if you read my book on The Emperor Has No Clothes, you see that the fusion of nation and state creates this problem for us. Hamas wants to rule the same way that the Likud is ruling. There are two political apparatuses fighting for monopoly of violence, the monopoly of their violence. And right now, the state of Israel has more monopoly of more deadly weapons of mass destruction than Hamas. So this goes, the use of violence has to go back not to Fanon, who was thinking in more generic terms, but to Max Weber, that you are dealing with a state that has monopoly of violence, wants to keep the monopoly of violence, and then contenders for that violence, whether it is Hamas or any other contender for the ruling estate, to become the ruling estate, becomes obviously violence. Violence is the means of state formation.
That was great. That's well said on that. And then I mean, on the current moment again, just to reflect on sort of your decades in the U.S. and the current moment we're in. If you're optimistic or things you're seeing, things like the flotilla, all of the energy in the street. I mean, you're in New York, and so you're seeing a lot of it. Do you think that we're at sort of an end cycle of Zionism? And then to bring it to your sort of your home country and your specialty of Iran, what will that mean for the future of Iran? I'm almost asking a dumb question of like, if the domino of Zionism does fall, is there anything for the Islamic Republic to push against at this point? And then will we see a wave of liberation take over other
Yeah.
neighboring countries?
I am not sure if Zionism falls. Zionism, like Islamism, is an ideology and it has its supporters and has had historical roots. So I'm neither sanguine nor waiting for it to happen. We have to think in alternative terms. And the question whether or not I'm optimistic reminds me of a glorious phrasing of James Baldwin in a conversation. He said, I have to be optimistic because I'm alive. So I am optimistic, but not in terms of that I will see in my lifetime the collapse of Zionism, collapse of the state of Israel. Yeah, absolutely. I am elated to see Greta Thunberg leading this flotilla. It's both environmentally and politically. She represents not just herself; it's a generational rethinking that is happening on our watch. So my concern is liberation of Palestinians and liberation of Israelis and liberation of Iranians. They're all the same liberation. That is, we need to have a trust in the facts of common interest of ordinary people on a globe, on a planet that is in dire need of preserving, of saving. I mean, it's not accidental that Greta Thunberg is both an environmentalist and a political activist. And I have no doubt that she has supporters inside Israel. We have to stop demonizing Israelis. We have to imagine Israelis want to join this global uprising. And this I'm not saying only after October 7. I said it when I was writing about the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
Israelis must be able to imagine themselves, Jay, in a post-Zionist world, as Muslims have to be able to imagine themselves in a post-Islamist world.
Yeah.
Unless that happens, nothing would they keep killing each other. Yeah. And so it is more an act of imagination. It is an act of education rather than my ideology versus your ideology. I have become increasingly drawn to the work of a magnificent Belgian political philosopher, Chantal Mouffe, and her idea of agonistic pluralism, which she posits it against Habermas's notion of consensus. Chantal Mouffe's argument is far more convincing because she says differences of opinion and differences of positions, etc., is normal, is natural. So we have to think of a political project in which it accommodates political differences rather than seeks consensus among all of them. So in that sense, the varied historical experiences that nations and people have had, if you allow for it to be evident and allow for it to express itself and treat it with respect and recognition that an Iranian is entitled to liberation and independence, a Palestinian is entitled to their nation, an Israeli is entitled to safety, etc., etc. You see that there is an emergence, the sight of the emergence of a different political thinking, rather than this Carl Schmitt Nazi figure that there is no, the political is predicated on enemy. So you are the enemy, I am the self. You are the other, and I am the self. And unless this happens, which is also extends even to a great philosopher like Emmanuel Levinas, that says the face of the other is the most inscrutable thing that can ever happen. And then they could not see the humanity of a Palestinian when Sabra and Shatila happened. Even for a great philosopher like Emmanuel Levinas, for whom I have the deepest admiration, couldn't see it, could not see the humanity of a Palestinian. If that were to be taken into consideration, a different kind of, and Chantal Mouffe is a person I'm reading very closely recently, then in that scenario, a Palestinian, an Israeli, an Iranian, a Turk, etc., they will all be able to imagine themselves. The task ahead is not to say which ideology is collapsing. All of these ideologies have lost their legitimacy. They don't have a legit. I mean, how could a Zionist come out and say, I'm a Zionist, and deal with this genocide that has happened on their watch? How could an Islamist live with the thing with Mullah Omar and Osama bin Laden and blowing up buildings and denying education to half of humanity just because they're girls? And I mean, Mullah Omar is or the Taliban in Afghanistan, is that a model? Is that a thing? That, in my opinion, is far more important to think and imagine and cultivate and teach, rather than waiting for Islamism and Zionism to collapse and then what?
Yeah.
How we have to see in what way can a human being who was born and raised in Israel and born and raised in Palestine to imagine themselves in that future.
Amazing. Well, if I could keep you for 10 more minutes, I need to pick your brain on cinema just because I love it so much. And you wrote Close Up, which was fantastic. My favorite Iranian film is The Color of Paradise, which I just think is so wonderful. But this is sort of what is your overarching sort of thesis on what Iranian cinema really was and why it is so sort of quietly subversive in a way? And so accessible. I mean, what interested it in your
original
work?
Title of The Color of Paradise is Rang Khoda, Color of God, which is very blasphemous, actually, when you say it. Listen, the book, first of all, my most recent book is on Kiarostami, is exclusively on Kiarostami, because he has had, may he rest in peace, an amazing system. I have a book that just came out a few months ago. Where is Abbas Kiarostami? Towards a post-colonial film philosophy. Is more of a film philosophy project. But my most basic sort of premise on Iranian cinema is that it is what it is. It has been, as it has been, so successful, so globally celebrated, because it is rooted in Persian poetry. But you don't see it because it's visual system. So I, in my book, Masters and Masterpieces of Iranian Cinema, I choose 12 filmmakers and 12 films that I elaborated into a system. Why is it that their particular take on realism is a different realism? Just calling it new realism doesn't work. So I try to open up the system, and from the earliest filmmakers like Golestan and Ghaffari and Forough Farrokhzad, etc., until we come to the latest, to see that they have generated, in effect, a new visual vocabulary, a new cinematic aesthetic epistemology, if I were to use that word. And then it took about 5 decades for that episteme to deliver itself, to articulate itself. And then right now, despite the fact that filmmakers like Asghar Farhadi and others are really great, amazing filmmakers, but they're not advancing Iranian cinema anymore because the system has exhausted itself. It is complete system. So it has to be understood in the completion of its system. And each one of them, Bahram Beyzai, Abbas Kiarostami, Amir Nadiri, any one of them, you go near them, you see that they have a world, they have a oeuvre, they're authorial in helping us understand the world in a way that one reason why it is so successful and globally celebrated is that the world was already in Iranian cinema. So when Iranian cinema went to the world, people could see themselves. So masters of world cinema, Kurosawa, John Ford, Satyajit Roy, etc., they were all part of the Iranian cinematic culture of 30s, 40s, and 50s before the rise of Iranian cinema of 1960s. Another key issue that is important for me is the role of trauma, the role of trauma in formation of a national cinema or national literature or national poetry. And the Iranian trauma is the coup of 1953, which is a national trauma, and then the war of Iran-Iraq War of 1980s, which is also a national trauma. By the same token, the work that I have done on Palestinian cinema is predicated on Nakba as a trauma. And we can expand it that, of course, Holocaust is also a central trauma. But it is only filmmakers like Gilles Pontecorvo in his early cinema that realized that trauma. And one of my theory, which I always promote when I teach my courses on cinema, is that Gilles Pontecorvo was a product of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. He was very active, politically active at the time. So when you look at his Battle of Algiers, his absolute masterpiece, you see there is a visual vocabulary that he borrows from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and applies it to the Algerian Revolution. You have to bring them together to see how they work. I show a chapter and verse by shots from Battle of Algiers and shots from Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So Iranian cinema, I just wrote my book on Kiarostami, so it's out of my system. I think I've done it.
You've done it.
Many of the contemporary filmmakers like Panahi and others are friends. I'm great admirers of them. I go and see. They're kind when I come to New York. They invite me to go to the screening, and I go and see it. But it is very difficult, Jay, at this point, after these masters, to say something new in Iranian cinema.
Yeah. Well, if people are watching and they haven't gotten into Iranian cinema or exposed, what are like the top three they should do? We give them three films.
Top three is Bahram Beyzai's Bashu, 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 The Little Stranger. It's absolute masterpiece. That's the first thing they should do. Amir Naderi's Davande, The Runner.
Never saw it.
It is a glorious film. And then Abbas Kiarostami's Close Up.
Close Up, okay, yeah, which is the classic. I'll put in The Color of Paradise if they want to sort of. It's
no, they would not. Yeah, I adore that film. I adore it. It's so magnificent, but it is a derivative of all these three.
Yeah, it's a more modern, beautiful little one. It was my first exposure. Well, it was amazing talking to you.
Thanks, Jay, for having me. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Let's see what happens in the world, but please keep writing and keep banging the drum.
We'll do the best we can. Take care, Jay.
So to leave you with some thoughts on my next guest, I admit that in the conversation with Hamid, I was vaguely dissatisfied with our exchange about the relationship between violence and liberation. It's not that I disagree with Hamid, when he put himself out there, as he called, a militant pacifist. But I feel like there's something more, there's a lot more to say about that subject. And I can't get myself to fully agree with the political position. It's not that I endorse violence or cheer it on, but I have trouble, and perhaps this aligns with a kind of Norman Finkelstein position I think he's put out there. I have trouble really dictating or demanding how others end up pursuing their liberation through, what we might want of only nonviolent means, etc. But I really do, really do agree with his suggestion that if a liberation movement embraces or even utilizes violence in order to achieve its goals, it might be poisoning its ultimate project of liberation from the very start. And we should at least be very skeptical of it philosophically, that it's not simply looking to, kick the current rulers out of the throne in order to simply just take their seat themselves, as he suggested. Perhaps, again, a scholar and historian with a certain focus on the trajectory and history of what happened in Iran is rightfully, highlighting that complication in that kind of trap. And if you haven't seen it, the Battle of Algiers, which we mentioned there, is just a masterpiece of cinema that presents this moment of liberation embracing violence in order to achieve its anti-colonial liberation, but perhaps simultaneously planting those seeds of militant Islamism, which is certainly not ideal. Anyway, if you haven't seen the Battle of Algiers, turn this off right now and go watch it, because you must. But so for me to discuss this relationship between violence and liberation, it's something I'm going to be doing more of on the show. And in particular, next week, I'm having a conversation with the author and scholar Michael Sawyer. He's at the University of Pittsburgh. He's written a lot on race and African experience, and in particular Malcolm X. So we're going to be focusing on the life and thoughts and ultimately the assassination of Malcolm X, who's someone who tiptoed this balance beam between violence and freedom and liberation in really fascinating ways until his life was ultimately cut off way too soon. We're also going to be discussing Malcolm X's visit to Gaza, which is something that I just recently learned had happened. I think I actually first saw it in a children's book. I'll put it on the screen if I can find it. That's on that subject. Actually, I haven't read that book, but I saw that I was like, Malcolm X was actually in Gaza. I had no idea. So it happened in late 1964, and led to an article which he penned for the Egyptian Gazette entitled Zionist Logic. It was in the newspaper the next day. I'll link to it in the description and the comment below. Because as you'll see in that short read, it's just like a page and a half to read the article. Malcolm was very much at that moment in the mid-60s tying Zionism, or at least noticing Zionism, was a part of what Kwame Nkrumah was calling in the mid-60s a neo-colonialist project, or Western-led imperial project of dollarization, etc. He was connecting Zionism to a much bigger and broader imperial issue. And when you start to tie those particular things together, you seem to always catch a bullet, which he certainly did. So we're going to talk about all of that next week with Malcolm Sawyer, and I'm really excited to get more into those really difficult, fraught conversations. And if you made it this far, please like and subscribe. Consider becoming a member, because if you really want to jump in on that level, I'm going to try to turn, like I said, that membership into a bit of a community building via monthly Zoom hangouts and maybe other ways to connect. So love you all, and I'll see you next time.